Welcome to Digging Deeper into Spiritual Practices, a Spiritual Seedlings interview with Nancy Flinchbaugh. I'm the author of several books, including Awakening, a contemplative primer on learning to sit. I want my readers to have opportunities to learn more about the spiritual practices discussed in my book. So I'm interviewing some contemplative experts. You can find out more about my books on my website at spiritualseedlings.com. Today I'm interviewing Therese Taylor-Stinson. She is a spiritual director, an elder in the Presbyterian Church, an author, and the founder of Spiritual Directors of Color Network. She also has a new book coming out soon called Walking the Way of Harriet Tubman, Public Mystic and Freedom Fighter. I also featured her in my book, Awakening, a contemplative primer on learning to sit. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to meet her and learn more about her important work in the field of contemplative spirituality. Welcome to Spiritual Seedlings interview, and today I'm speaking with Therese Taylor-Stinson. And I'd like to start, Therese, by thanking you, first of all, taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me today. And secondly, I'd just like to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for inviting me to be part of your interviews. And you didn't have to, and I appreciate that you remembered me. As for me, I am a retired senior federal program analyst that was an expert in federal regulatory activity. I'm sure I'm not an expert in that anymore. I've been retired since 2012. And I also served and still am on the roster of the Interagency Sharing Neutrals program, which is a program of mediators who mediate equal employment opportunity disputes across government, for which I'm still on the roster, but I don't do much in that area anymore. I'm a graduate of the Shalem Institute, multiple programs I've been through with the Shalem Institute, and I guess the most impactful was the Spiritual Guidance Program. And I am a mother and a wife. We will be married 42 years in September. And my daughter, grown woman, 5th grade teacher, has 2 children, ages 8 and 11. And the 11-year-old is getting ready to go to middle school. So pray for her.
Middle school. That's a hard time, isn't it?
They said they had a little program at the end of school. So that was yesterday or the day before. And the principal said at the end that middle school is probably the most difficult segment of children's education. And so we should all pray for the kids that are on their way to 6th grade. Middle school starts in 6th grade now. So that means we have developed in some kind of way other than just in when we have the school systems, children are starting to be more advanced at an earlier age now.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. We'll certainly pray for your granddaughter as she begins middle school. I realize we have a couple of things in common. We met at Shalem, and so I also enrolled in their program. We're also mediators. I didn't know that you were a mediator. Yeah. That's cool to find out. So you have been really busy since you retired. I know one of the things you have done is to start the Spiritual Directors Network of Spiritual Directors of Color. And tell me a little bit about that. What led you to organize that group?
I was in the Shalem program, Spiritual Guidance Program, and coming and in that program, I was only one of 2 African American, both of us women, in the program, in that cohort. And actually I had been around Shalem for a while before I decided to go through the Spiritual Guidance Program. So most of the programs, events, or whatever I would go to, I would be either one of a minimal amount of African Americans or people of color in general, or the only a person of color. in the group. So as we began the spiritual guidance program, the other woman who was African American and I began a conversation almost immediately about being the only ones in the program, and being sure that our experience that had led us to Shalane and wanting to be spiritual directors was not something unique to us, that there were probably many of us who probably are having experiences, maybe they don't have the words to define, or, you know, maybe they're not aware that there are programs that could develop them as spiritual directors. Maybe they don't even know a spiritual director might be helpful to them. And so we were wondering where those people were. And so the conversation continued. And as we got to the end, near the end of the program, for me personally, I started thinking about what could my final paper be. I had many choices, as you probably know. I could have written on one of the themes or one of the mystics that they kind of highlight during the program. But I decided that I needed to know how what I was learning with all white authors in this program, how it related to the experiences of people of color. So I decided I was going to do a research paper, which my spiritual director at the time said probably more of an exploration than a real research paper. But I, first of all, researched to find books that would help me make the case for the experiences of people of color and contemplative spirituality. And I came up with about 20 books. It was hard. There were really no books specifically written about persons of color and the practice of spiritual direction, except for one book, which was actually called Soul Care and not Spiritual Direction, but one book that actually did go back into history, even during times of enslavement, and talked about the people who basically were performing those kinds of tasks with one another, but they might have been called like spiritual mothers or fathers. They may have been prominent people in the community or something like that. And during enslavement, it was probably done in secret because, at least in the beginning, they weren't allowed to really communicate with one another. So I read that book, and then I uncovered Barbara Holmes, who at the time I did not know her, but I found her book, Joy Unspeakable, and voila, there I found her taking experiences of African Americans in different processes, some civil rights and those kinds of things, some church related and other things, and talking about how it looks different, what it is and how it looks different. And so it corresponded with my own sense of, as an African American, and having been in these different situations, for how that was. So those two books in a way were my foundations, but I also needed to explain to my readers what spirituality was. So I was introduced by Martha Campbell, who was the director for the spiritual guidance program when I went through it. She introduced me to Thea Bowman, a Franciscan nun, and her book was very helpful for describing contemplation from the perspective of persons of color, and actually the only person, because she was Roman Catholic, and at one point contemplative practice was mostly, anyway, a Roman Catholic endeavor. And so her book was helpful. And then a lot of other books, like Peter J. Parris's book on Black spirituality, African spirituality, Gaylord Wilmore, who is, I actually got to meet later after writing that book. He was in my Presbyterian, National Capital Presbytery. Some of his writings on Blacks and religious experience. And so all of that led to my final paper, which was called Black Spirituality and the Art of Spiritual Direction. And I turned it into my mentor or advisor, the person that was walking with me through the program. and he rejected it. He told me it wasn't contemplative. And so I pushed back and said, give it to Martha Campbell and let her read it and tell me it's not contemplative. So anyway, I guess maybe about a week went by, and finally he wrote me this beautiful letter with a story in it about a pianist, a musician, and how he would compose his pieces. And the pieces that he composed, when he played them, did not necessarily come across to the people that were listening the same way he intended as he was playing them. And so he sort of compared my paper and his response to me initially to someone composing, a piece of music. And anyway, my paper was received by Shalane. And meanwhile, I had a couple of readers while I was writing it, I had 3 readers, all 3 encouraging me to publish the paper. And so I sent it to Spiritual Directors International's Presence Journal, and they accepted it, challenged me a little bit, but they accepted it. And it published in December 2014, I believe it was. No, I'm sorry, December 2009. It published just about a year after my graduation from the Shalane program. So that was the beginning of, we went to the SDI conference the year after our last residency, and saw that there's, comparatively speaking, it's a larger group of people, but comparatively speaking, there was still not a lot of people of color. And we met some women. I think we were in a little room getting some food or something, and we met some women, and they were at the conference, and we started talking about the books that we were reading, Barbara Holmes, and this book called Beyond Suffering that was one of the writers was actually a white male with a Black woman who were writing that book. The people that we met were saying, yes, we'd read these books too, and they agreed they didn't really get to the point like we wanted to. We had dinner together with them, and then my partner in the Shalane program and I decided we would invite Spiritual Directors International, gave us an opportunity on the last day to network. And so we invited people of color that were there at the event to come to our table. And I'm sure we were all surprised, but I'll just speak for myself. I was really surprised that when they got to the table, we had people, not just African Americans. Being located in Washington, D.C. most of my life and everything, my mind was thinking very narrowly African Americans, but we were at Spiritual Directors International. And so we found people at our table, Koreans, Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States, but still a Latina presence, and Africans from Africa, Cameroon, and South Africa, and then a handful of, we were mostly women, African American women from around the country, and someone who was planning the event for next year in Houston, who wanted to hear, our responses so that they could be more responsive with their event of next year. So while we were at that table talking, this was already in my mind because I'm in the process of writing my final paper, but I didn't say it out loud. But somebody said, maybe we could write a book together. And so everybody said yes. And so I said, yes, here's a notebook, put your names in here and write your names. And we'll get together and talk about it some more. So everybody wrote their name, and I had their names and addresses and where they were from. I came back home really excited and started telling some of my friends, about these people that gathered, and we might be writing a book. And this is 2008. Some of my friends started inviting people that they know to come and join our group. And also my peer group, I happen to have been in an African-American peer group. My peer group members were joining the network. It's very loosely now, we're not incorporated yet, but still, we're gathering, we're having conference calls. but we were nowhere near ready to exactly write a book at the time. So the network started. We started having conference calls. We started talking about things we could do. We had actually a session where we actually took the time to discern a vision and mission statement for the network, which is still very vital. It's been changed a little bit. We just got a new board, so it got changed a little bit more this year, not really changing any of the intent at all, but being maybe a little more specific about certain things. Those first 6 years or so were kind of rough for me anyway. But in 2014, I believe, September 2014, we were incorporated. And so now we are beginning to thrive. We are beginning to partner with other contemplative organizations that may have been around a little longer, but are teaching, and they're asking us in to partner with them to teach so that there is the person of color perspective. We've now written 3 books. The first book was Embodied Spirits, where we just told our stories of our own journeys into contemplative practice and as spiritual directors. The second book was Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, which I edited solo. It won an award for social awareness from the Indie Author Legacy Awards. And our third book, Kaleidoscope, was edited by Anita Adesanya. I do have an entry in the book that I wrote with a partner, Reverend Paula Owens Parker, who is another Presbyterian. And the title of I think it's chapter 8, and the title of our chapter is Internal Liberation. And Paula and I, who are also both Emotional Emancipation Circle facilitators, used mostly Thurman, but some other ideas as well, to talk about how people of color can find internal freedom, which can lead them more deeply into who they are in a contemplative life.
Wow, so you've been on quite a journey, and that's really exciting to hear how you just put out a call and people came together, and then slowly you built the network. And I think you were the leader, right? You were leading them.
I'm the one that came up with the idea. My partner at Shalane, I would call her. She didn't necessarily reach out to me, but she was responsive when I would call her, and say, do you want to have a network meeting and everything? So she would show up at the meeting, and she was on the first board of directors for a while. But basically, most of the work to pull us together and to continue to bring people into the network, and then actually to incorporate us. I was at least the one with the initiative to do that, if not completely by myself. Everybody in the network has told other people, and some have been more instrumental than others. So we're a network and a group now, and I don't want to try to take all of the credit like I did it all by myself, but I was the initiator of all of it. Mm-hmm.
Well, it shows what one person can do when they have a mission, and that's wonderful that you've been able to publish 3 books now, and there's a beginning body of information for spiritual directors of color, because it is different, right? If you're a spiritual director, you're trying to help a person navigate their spiritual life, and it's very different sometimes for people of color who are experiencing a lot of discrimination and maybe live in a different culture. It's hard for majority culture people to sometimes be relevant, right? I mean, not entirely, but it's important so
one of the major issues is around silence, which Shalane and I, as far as I know anyway, most other contemplative organizations sort of make a priority. And if you are a person of color, it could be viewed as being pushed upon you. And the only thing about silence is that you don't have to have been on the slave ship that came here in 1619 to carry trauma from that period, because they have now, epigenetics has shown that those people who were the descendants of people who came through the Middle Passage do have a trauma gene. It's the same way Jewish people are said to have a trauma gene, and Vietnam veterans are also considered to have that same trauma gene. And what happens in life is that, you know, that trauma, especially if you're living in an environment where you're not as valued as the dominant culture, that trauma is compounded. And so sometimes silence is not that silence itself is necessarily bad, but being silenced is something different from entering willingly into silence on your own. And when our ancestors got off of the boat and landed here in what became the United States and were enslaved, even on the boat, they weren't allowed to speak to one another. And when they found themselves off the boat, they weren't allowed to speak as well. So for a long time, they were silenced. And then to impose silence upon someone of African American descent without consideration of how they may receive that or how that may be for them is not a good thing. And so I'm not suggesting that silence isn't helpful or that people cannot adjust to it, but it is not the only way to becoming contemplative, or it's not the only way to have a deeper relationship with that which is greater than us. And so the consideration needs to be to allow people to use silence in the way that works best for them.
Okay, thank you. And what sort of services does the network provide?
So we provide networking. So right now, and it's really working well right now, we have a Facebook page. It's closed. It's only for those people in the network. But we have all kinds of events and learnings, you know, different educational events, or that people in whatever their normal context is put on our website and makes it available to the people in the network. And especially now, we've really gotten really active where there are some predominantly white organizations that are offering spiritual direction or contemplative training or guidance, and they are inviting us to come in and help them to also make it a multicultural experience and to learn about the concerns and issues that are specific to people of color. So the networking is going on, you know, and it's becoming more vital now. Some people that come into the network are still in programs, so they're getting a chance to actually use what they're learning in other contexts, and also to share what they're learning now with us who maybe have been away from the program for some time. So we're doing what we said we were going to do. We're networking. Our books, we've written 3 so far. I won't say that we will never write another one. I don't know what it is now, if ever. But our writings has gotten the word out definitely that people of color need to be considered. And this is what it looks like from our perspective. And so I think in my own mind anyway, we've done tremendous work, you know, even being a very small organization overall, and having a lot of hurdles to overcome to get here.
Yeah, so it seems like you've done a wonderful job creating that network for other spiritual directors of color so that you can share information. And then you're also creating a body of information for all of us. You know, I guess sometimes people from the dominant culture may be a spiritual director for somebody, a person of color, and they may need to be better educated in order to do that. And I guess another thing is, right, you can go to your website and locate spiritual directors of color that are available across the country or maybe around the world even. Is that right?
Yes, around the world. And actually, we have people from South Africa, mostly South Africa right now, but I think we did have people from Philippines, Cameroon. Some people have kind of, lost interest or whatever, and then others have come in. So every time I think I'm losing people, I gain more than I had before. So yes.
Well, I really enjoy having a spiritual director, and I think one of the good things that's happened during the pandemic is I think we've all realized how we can do things online. And so if I, for example, if I were a person of color looking for a spiritual director as a person of color, I could go to your website and find somebody,
Yeah.
and then communicate with them online. I wouldn't necessarily have to be in the same city with them. So I think
Yes.
that's a wonderful thing that you provide also.
Yes. And actually my own spiritual direction practice, and I hear this from others as well, has doubled since the pandemic. So many people, if they aren't in a place where they're trying to find how they can wash their clothes or where they can get groceries or how they're going to pay the rent or where they're going to go when they're being evicted, if they're not having those problems, then they're actually considering on their own initiative, what can I do once we get on the other side of this? And so it's been wonderful to sit with many people of color, because at first, when I first started spiritual, when I had what I call my guinea pigs, when I was going through the program, they were people of color because I was asking my friends. But when I put up my shingle, so to speak, and people came to me, it was mostly white people who were coming to me. But now I have a thriving practice with mostly people of color. And even though the white members who are coming to me because they want to know what can we do in this current situation we find ourselves, which is more than just COVID-19.
Well, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and for the wonderful network that you founded that's available now around the world. And thank you for the books that you've done. I bow to you and your good work. So thank you. Thank you, Therese, for all your work and for the groundwork you've laid for other people in our country. So is there anything you'd like to add as a closing comment?
No, just to say thank you again, Nancy, for having me. I appreciate it. And I hope that our conversation is helpful to others.
Okay. Well, I've learned a lot from you, and I so appreciate you taking time to look over my book, Awakening. And I think I added a lot from your perspective. You made it a lot richer. So thank you again for that too. So I hope I'll see you again at Shalem for one of the gatherings.
Yes, I'm sure I'll see you around.
Thank you for listening to this interview with Therese Taylor-Stinson. You can learn more about the Spiritual Directors of Color Network on their website at sdcnetwork.org. Find a directory of Spiritual Directors of Color, order books by their members, sign up to become a member and donate, as well as to learn about upcoming events and read their blog and listen to their podcasts. Here are 3 books, collaborations by members of the Spiritual Directors of Color Network. Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, which is Stories of Contemplation and Justice, which was edited by Therese Taylor-Stinson, received an Indie Author Legacy Award as Author of the Year in the area of social awareness. 2 other books available are Embodied Spirits, Stories of Spiritual Directors of Color, and also Kaleidoscope, Broadening the Palette in the Art of Spiritual Direction. Look for Therese Taylor-Stinson's upcoming book, Walking the Way of Harriet Tubman, Public Mystic and Freedom Fighter, to be released soon by Broadleaf Books. This has been a Spiritual Seedlings interview with Nancy Flinchbaugh. You can find out more about contemplative practices on my website and in my book, Awakening, a Contemplative Primer on Learning to Sit.